And our reading this morning is from Nehemiah chapter 10. We've already done the reading ourselves here, and it is rather long, but for your sakes, if you like to turn to Nehemiah 10, the reading is there from verse 34 to the end. Now, the reading encompasses a whole set of promises that the people of God were going to set about to do. That's really the gist of the reading. They set out a statement of faith, if you would call it, and intention. So we're going to call this a new beginning, a new beginning. If we remember the story, Nehemiah had arrived with a concern for Jerusalem because he'd heard lots of stories about its bad situation. The people who were there had started to rebuild the temple, and the building of the temple was on its way, and they were having certain celebrations in the temple, but the wall was not built and the city was not built. And so when Nehemiah arrived, he saw that it was all right to have the temple, but there was no security. And so he made an orientation visit around the walls of the city and decided that the first thing that should happen should be to rebuild the wall. This was his commitment as governor of the province, and he put his finger on the button. Security was the important thing. The wall had to be rebuilt. And so in the early chapters of Nehemiah, there was an arrangement made whereby the citizens would all be brought in to the building of the wall, and in a period of time, the wall was rebuilt. So chapter 10 is the beginning of the new beginning. The wall is being built. The situation now is ready for, should we call it, inaugurating. So the people themselves were joyous, they were happy, they were upbeat. Nehemiah had given them a sense of identity. He'd given them a sense of possibility for the future. The temple was there being activated, and ceremonies were being done, and people had some structure brought back to their lives. So the chapter gives us an air of a new beginning as they came to grips with their past and their future. And so in order to begin the beginning, they set down a whole set of things which are now in chapter 10. So they made these list of promises of what they were going to do, to go back to observe the law of God, to observe the ceremonies, to observe the priesthood, to observe all those things that go to make a Jew or Israel the nation it was. So let's talk about the document. It was an agreement in writing, and begins with a long list of names of leaders and their signatures to the document that was going to be signed. This is a serious state of things, because it means that Israel had been brought to a particular point in the history of re-establishing the city, re-establishing their culture, recognizing the nature of the law of Moses, bringing together so many things that for so many years, 70 years, had been in abeyance. Then Nehemiah gave them a kind of sense of hope in this new beginning, and a certain level of enthusiasm as they come back to this. They were coming to terms with their past and determined to shape the future by wholesome, healthy attitudes. So it's as if Nehemiah's friends and those who were involved in the work of rebuilding were praying like this: Lord, we don't want this to simply be an empty series of words. We want it to be a promise that is nailed down. We declare our dependence. We'll sign our names to prove that we will keep the promise, so as to set Israel on a new footing for its future. So if you look at chapter 10, you will discover a list of 84 names. Nehemiah's comes first. The following Nehemiah, you'll find that the names of 20 priests are there from verses 1 through 8. 17 Levites from verses 9 through 18. and 44 others who were called leaders or heads of families or homes, from verses 10 to 27. Well, there's not much in the way of profit in reading names, so we won't read them. But more important than mere names, though, is that what verse 28 says was true of every name that appeared in the document. And let's read that. Verse 28 of chapter 10. Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, and all those who had knowledge and understanding. This is a statement that collectively draws everybody into the fact that now we are beginning again, and they've left no one out except the children, because the children didn't sign the document, of course. So here they were separating themselves from the heathen roundabout. They dealt with the crops, they dealt with the tithes, they dealt with the laws of the Sabbath. Everything was tied up. And here they were coming together to solemnize their identity before the law of God, in the house of God, before the people of God. It's pretty heavy stuff. They were making a statement that we are now recognizing our past, looking with hope to the future. And this was healthy. I don't know if we ever do that ourselves. Where have I come from in the sense of my walk with God? What have I been like in the past? How well have I done in my walk with God? What have been the pitfalls? Where have things gone wrong and why? And all these are the factors that worried them, and they were determined that they were going to get it right. Now, what about the promises? From verse 29, there's a general promise to obey what God had declared. In verse 30, the people specifically said that they would obey him in their homes. Interesting. It wasn't obey him in all the observance of what was going on in the temple. They began with the home. That makes a lot of sense. They were surrounded by heathen tribes and pagan people who marched to a different drumbeat. The easiest thing in the world would have been to lose their distinctiveness as the people of God. And so the leaders of each home promised in verse 30 what they were going to do. And what does it say? Verse 30, where are we? Yes, we promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us, or take their daughters for our sons. So there was a facing up that things had broken down in the family area over the past number of years. And so verse 30 is a recognition that they're going to do better at it and teach in the home the specific nature and the quality and the class of people that they were to be Israelites. They said, we won't shrug our shoulders, yawn, and say it doesn't matter when our kids want to mix and mingle with the crowd out there. Distinctive, respectable leaders have distinctive, respectable homes. And so they were making a statement for the family to start with. So important. So if there was going to be quality in the worship, there had to be quality in the home. If the temple was to function in the nature of the seriousness of what they were about, then everything began at home in the teaching of the family, what the temple services and the tithes and the offerings had to say. The point I want to make is very clear. When morals of a nation are under stress, the home is the first to suffer. And thinking about this, I read a statement from Billy Graham who put it this way: the immutable law of sowing and reaping has held sway. We are now the hapless possessions of moral depravity, and we seek in vain for a cure. The tares of indulgence have overgrown the wheat of moral restraint. Our homes have suffered. When the morals of society are upset, the family is the first to suffer. The home is the basic unit of society, and a nation is only as strong as the strength of the home. So if you're thinking about priorities, particularly if you're a parent, think about the home. Start with the home, because what you produce from the home is a statement of what you're about as a person or as a couple. So the home became a very important center of attention. Next, the signers promised to conduct business in an obedient manner. Verse 31 says, as for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day, and we will forgo the crops the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. This promise was not meaningless, because they had to observe the law of the Sabbath, which meant no work, no activity, no trading, no fun, no going to the beach, no football, nothing of that nature. It was, as shall we say, the Lord's Day. It was the day set apart for them. And they had strict kosher laws for the observance of the day. We might find them amusing, but to them, they were real and serious. They could not do anything on the Sabbath. All the meals were cooked the day before, which must have been rather more simpler then in those early days. But today it's a complicated effort. To cook a meal involves so much in the way of turning on lights, turning on gas or electricity. Under the law, it is forbidden. So how do you cook on the Sabbath? You don't. You prepare the meal the day before. You don't even turn on a light. A friend of mine in Bolivia who was Jewish, I asked him about this. He said, as a child, I hated the Sabbath, just hated it. Because when we came home from school on Friday afternoon, before the sun set, we had to tear off hundreds strips of toilet paper and fold them so that there was a whole heap of toilet paper in the toilet, so as to avoid the work of tearing toilet paper off. Down to the smallest idiosyncrasy. There was no journey. They had cars, he said, but because there were cars, the cars needed work to make them to go. So we were made to walk from our home to the synagogue, a Sabbath day's journey. Now, to us, it seems so strange and so oppressive, but to them, their reality was this. Modernity has affected us as well as the Israelites. And you could look at some of the Israelite communities, the Jewish communities in this country and elsewhere. Some of their beliefs, they are doing war to hang on to their culture and to the observance of the Mosaic law. Now, to us, a lot of it is absurd, but to them it's real. And this was the survival of their culture, was in the survival of their religion in those days. So they still said, when the Saturday Sabbath begins and we see those who want to do business coming over the hills toward Jerusalem, we will say, we're not open. We'll talk with you tomorrow. And when the seventh year rolls around, we'll rest from sowing and reaping until the next year. When our brother owes us a debt, we will look on it as God would have us to look on it and forgive it. They will be released from their debt because our God orders it. The blessings of our people will reach out to be a blessing to those around us who do not know him. And so to them, it was a real thing. The Jews had declared, first things come first, nothing less. Next, they turned their attention to the place of worship. 9 times in chapter 10 from verse 32 to 39, the house of the Lord is mentioned. And it's not difficult to miss it. We also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly for the showbread. Likewise, we cast lots for the supply of wood among the priests and Levites and the people. And in order that they might bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of every tree annually, we will also bring the first of our dough, called their meal, our contributions, the fruit of every tree. It's quite spectacular, because being an Israelite, a Jew, did not involve being born into a family, going to the temple. It encompassed every aspect of life. And they were rediscovering the wealth, the richness, the meaning of the law of Moses as they came back to this, after having been away 70 years. Putting it all together, verse 39 says this: we will not neglect the house of our God. So they've dealt with the family life, they've dealt with their busy daily lives, now they've dealt with the house of God. So it seems that the wall was not enough. Nehemiah the builder needed Ezra the minister. Now, there's a problem between us, and it would require quite a bit of study. What is the time factor, and how does Ezra fit with Nehemiah? Because the two books go together. Where does one fit with the other? We do know that after this declaration here in chapter 10, it seems that Nehemiah left and went back to Babylon. His term of service as administrator in Jerusalem was over, so he returned to Babylon. And in this interim period, it seems that Ezra came into his own particular ministry. Possibly that's the way I'm putting it anyway. So he comes into his own. Now, Ezra is a priest. Nehemiah is a civil servant. So you've got two different outlooks, very, very different. Ezra was an introvert, a teacher. Nehemiah was an extrovert, a man of action, perception. Ezra was conscious of the presence of God with him. Nehemiah felt that it was God who enabled him to do the work. Ezra felt that God was continually coming down to him, while Nehemiah was continually going up to God. By what do I mean by that? How many prayers are recorded from Nehemiah? He was a man of prayer, as well as being an administrator. And so there was a kind of complementing between the two of them in their personalities. Ezra would have said, God works within us, while Nehemiah would have said, we are workers together with him. Ezra was ashamed to ask for soldiers, while Nehemiah gladly accepted captains and horsemen. We're not all alike, but we are all able to be used in the service of God, if first there be a willing mind. So we have these two wonderful characters. Now, reading Ezra, the book of Ezra, some of it's not very nice reading, because he was having to knock them into shape. And I say that advisedly, because that's what he did. He got angry with them because their behavior, their daily attitudes, their observance of the law had a lot of screws to be tightened, nails to be hammered into place. And so the effect of Nehemiah, of Ezra's work on what Nehemiah had done was long-lasting, profound and lasting. The immediate results amongst the people were despair. Can we ever get it right? There's so many details to observe. But despair at their own shortcomings was quickly followed by delight at the revelation of God's work for them, and how it all began to come together. You know, it was a birthday of mind and heart, and they felt that they had got it right. And they had made every effort to do that. And one is to admire this incredible effort of rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the city. And in the middle of it was this culture factor being injected by Nehemiah and Ezra. So it was a birthday of mind and heart. Lots of people were happy, rejoicing. Some cried because they knew about the past. And now they were re-beginning, a new beginning. And that brought emotion. Would it ever happen? Yes, they were there. So a new beginning. And to all observances, looking at it, it looked great. It was wonderful as an experience. And then Nehemiah returns 12 years later. I returned 40 years later, and it was a wonderful story of what God had done. But here there's a marked difference. When he comes back after 12 years, there's trouble. They thought it was right. Everything was correct and right. But was it? So when we get into the further chapters going on, we discover things. To all intents and purposes, what they see is a new culture, everything's functioning. But what's going on undercover? What's going on that nobody actually can see? One or two would know, but nobody talked about it. And that started to worry me, because how like we are to these people. I remember attending a synagogue service in Bolivia years ago with my friend, the Jewish moneylender. He was in the right job. And so he invited me, and I went along to the synagogue service on the Saturday. And I got the Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, peace on the Sabbath. And so I sat there at the back. I was invited actually to preach. And so they asked me, do you come from Cohen, which was the family of the week to do the reading? And I said, no, I'm a Gentile. Shabbat Shalom. They were very gracious. Shabbat Shalom. Anyway, while they were doing the readings from the law, I let my eyes wander around. There were about 20, 25, 30 people there. And I noticed two young fellows in the service were sitting right up front. And during the reading of the law, I couldn't believe it, but one young fellow had the local newspaper out reading the sports page. And I couldn't sort of get my head around this, because my culture wouldn't permit that. It was too obvious. It was too standoutish. But it dawned on me, he was the solution. He was there. That was what was important. Doing what he was doing was not as important as being there. You see, it was a matter of service. It was a matter of custom. It was a matter of doing it. What I felt and what I thought while I was there was something completely outside. And this seems to be part of human nature. What was going on, and how were things 12 years later? What were you like in your keenness as a younger believer, and what are you like now? Cool? Lazy? Hazy? Things are not as important? Because when he came back, Nehemiah set about to do some investigation. Things apparently looked right. But we find out in following chapters, Tobiah was back, and Tobiah rented an apartment in the temple. Now, what does that mean? Tobiah was the pain in the neck problem who had caused so much trouble amongst the Jews in their resettlement in the city. And he was public enemy number one, but somehow this guy had a rented apartment in the temple. He should have been a long way away from the restoration. And so the first thing that Nehemiah did when he came back was he visited Tobiah there in the temple. I'm sure he didn't go alone, because the result was he chucked him out, literally chucked him out, got his furniture, his blankets, his tables, his chairs, and threw them out into the street. He got rid of one of the sources of the problem from the original time. You see, the presence of that man there affected the attitudes of people and what they did in the meantime. The temple chambers were cleansed and refurnished. The Levitical tithes that they promised that they were going to do were reimposed. The strong measures to end the desecration of the Sabbath had to be brought back. Intermarriage with the heathen again was a problem. You see, the document that they had signed and agreed to as the beginning of the new beginning, how many years later, 10 years later, things were beginning to change and revert to what it might have been like before. So Nehemiah didn't hesitate to bring about, let's call it corporal punishment. He beat him up. And you go into the book of Ezra, things got physical in Ezra. What like were these people to be treated like this? That was the question. Stiff-necked, I suppose is one of the words, reprobate, lazy, careless, going along with the flow. What a sad picture. Nehemiah chases Jonathan, the grandson of the high priest Elisha, from the temple because he married a Moabitess. The book ends with the brief personal prayer. The brief personal prayer of Nehemiah. Remember me, O God. I tried to do things for the good of your people. And I get the feeling that he still had the highest of ambitions, but he still at the same time felt they let me down, or they let themselves down. So there's a very important point coming out in all this. We do not want to leave this without referring to it. Ultimately, these people failed to follow through with their commitment. Subsequent history reveals that all the old habits had returned. All the old sins were revived amongst them. The nation once again lost the blessing of God upon it. Yeah. And so we drift into these 400 years of silence between the Old and New Testaments. They said all these now join their brothers, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God. And within 10 years, it was a different picture. How like that are we? They were depending upon their own efforts to obey. They bound themselves with a curse and an oath. They were saying, we'll do this or else. But it all ended. There's some things that we can learn here as principles. Firstly, Jesus got it right in reviewing the history of his day in the light of what we know about now about Nehemiah. And Jesus says this, not very pleasant what he said, you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. That was pretty basic, right down at the roots. So there has to be something else in the ingredient in the mix that keeps us from going backwards. And Paul puts his finger in it, or on it. Romans 12:1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. That's it. You see, the bodies were doing everything mechanically. What was going on in the mind and the heart, that was the point and that was the problem. And that's why Jesus said what he did. It's all lip service. That young guy sitting reading the newspaper in the synagogue, he was there. That was all that was important. He was observing the law. Where his heart was, where his mind was something else. The message says, puts it this way. So here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, and going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out readily recognize what he wants from you, and quickly respond to it, unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you when the mind is engaged with the Spirit of God. So I want to leave ourselves now with 3 points. 3 points. 1, each generation needs to discover God for themselves. We must do that. It's not good enough to take on the God of your parents. Find him for yourself. Discover him and let him be Lord of your life. A personal crisis and an ongoing spiritual development must proceed from this. The impact of a spiritual renewal post-conversion is the crisis for us all. Without it, we drift into formalism, into doing it all from memory without paying any inward spiritual attention to conviction. Yeah? We've got to find God for ourselves. Discover a new experience in God, an awakening. Call it what you like. And I remember when I was 18, 19, one night at home, I discovered. I felt that. The emotion, the power, it gripped me. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Being not conformed, but transformed. It's the mind. It's in the mind. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the outflow of life. The outflow is a life that is continually being refreshed and impacting others. So when we come to this point of consecration, dedication to the cause of Christ in the living of this life of transformation, there is a constant refreshment taking place within the life that keeps you from going back, but rather leads you on to go forward as in seriousness. You see, it's no longer about me. It's about Christ. It's a life centered on Christ, what pleases him, not what pleases me. Thirdly, the loss of distinction and conformity to the world go hand in hand. Do you want to know today whether you have really conformed to this world or not? Check out your distinction. I don't mean you should check out your religious lifestyle. I mean, check out your authenticity compared to New Testament Christianity. Look at your life, your home, your work, your worship, and then ask yourself, am I really distinctive in the way I do my life? Could a person read the real me and see God's message on display? And so here we have this incredible contrast between Nehemiah 10. They had it all right, but it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't sufficient. And we can think in our own Christian life experience, we've got it all right, but have we? Has there been a dedication? Has there been a transformation? Has there been an opening of life and an understanding and experience in the presence of God to make real the work of Calvary? Not I, but Christ, be honored, praised, and glorified. So it centers on Christ. Unfortunately, Nehemiah, it centered on a building. It centered upon rules. It centered upon everything that they could memorize. But the heart was not the question. And that's the wonderful difference. Whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. It's quality in morality, quality in spirituality, quality. May God bless us and help us to realize that we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of work to do. So Heavenly Father, as we come to the conclusion of this message this morning, help us to get a clear picture of divine reality. Getting it right is so important, but the heart must be there within it. The mind must also be there, because the mind is to be transformed. and it's in the mind and then through the heart that your Spirit works to our translation for our blessing, but for your glory. Father, we realize that the process may be painful. The process will be slow, but you are a God with plenty of time on hand. And we ask, Father, that you will work in us. Help us to find you again, to discover you, to be blessed and encouraged, to be lifted up, so that our relationship daily should be one of vitality, vigor, emotion, thanksgiving, praise, and glory to your name. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.